Okay, this video is to provide my review of Chapter 16, Myths and Realities, an Overview of the Plains. And this is by C. Roderick Wilson. The chapter starts out talking about the fact that the imagery of the Plains Indians has become the imagery of all Aboriginal people in Canada and probably North America. A lot of this has been accomplished by media portrayal, like we saw in the Real Engine documentary. But it has some real impacts on relationships with governments, relationships with academics, and so forth. Stereotypical assumptions based on the reality are problematic to drilling down to understanding Plains Indians as well as Aboriginal people from other parts of the country. So I don't pretend to get all of the points brought up by Wilson in this chapter, but I'll start out with what he's trying to say in terms of the stereo relationship. He's arguing that the stereo relationship has no basis in reality, and that we need to be looking at that. The first argument he brings up is an archaeological argument. The fact that the Plains Indians haven't always lived or hunted or existed the way that they did in the 1800s as captured in a time capsule by the media and by movies. So the archaeological record talks about the people being in that area for 12,000 years, and the people that were in that area were not necessarily the people that live there today. There's been a whole lot of movement in and out of that territory from a lot of different First Nations from back east and so forth. The two main areas that are covered are the Athabascans and the Algonquins, and the languages derived from those two language stocks. So we start off with the spear throwers and large animals, including extinct animals like mastodons and things like that. Then from there they have the bow and arrow, which improved the technology and helped improve hunting, making it more efficient. And finally the buffalo pound. I had to ask last night what the buffalo pound was, and so it's simply what it is. It's a method where you chase the buffalo in a certain direction, and eventually they get into this pen and they get cornered because the gate stops them, and so what they do is they become stuck in a pound or in a field or whatever, so that they're there to slaughter. It's a kind of a variation of the buffalo jump, but I think that the pound idea is a lot more humane than the buffalo jump was. So the second point is that continuing on this point, sorry, not the second point, that the Plains people were adjusting and developing a relationship to a lot of the shifts in the climate, environment, frequent changes in game population, again including extinct animals. And as they move forward with new tools require new skills require new teaching, and all of this was done within a framework of social cooperation. So what Wilson is saying is this particular stereotype of the Plains Indian does not speak to or imagine changes of Blackfoot or Plains Indians prior to this piece of time where the prairie Indians became the image or icon of all of us, and did not allow for all of the changes prior to that point, or allow the changes after that point. So the stereotype, according to Wilson, has no roots. It does not speak to change, and in fact it denies change. The second point is has to do with the extent to which life has changed as a result of the introduction of the horse and the gun. The horse and the gun. The gun was introduced probably around 1600s, and my understanding of the whole thing is that it probably came from the French and the Dutch and colonizers on the East Coast, and through trading networks of Aboriginal people made a lot of the Western hardware like guns, coffee pots or teapots or whatever, forks, knives, things like that, made their way to Aboriginal communities out west without the Aboriginal communities out west even meeting a non-native person. So through the economic network, the trade network between nations prior to contact, the guns and other European wares found themselves moving to the west. So that happened about 1600, and then the Spanish people, the Spanish colonizers, brought in the horse. Both of those technologies vastly increased the efficiency of the hunt. It allowed the hunters to catch more food, to gather more resources, with the horse to be able to transfer or bring about with them larger things like larger teepees, larger amounts of goods and so forth on the travel. And it allowed Aboriginal hunters, plains hunters, the ability to care for more than one wife. The article refers to polygamy relationships. I think that's the right way. I'm not pretending to know the kinship stuff very well. But the gun and the horse allowed for the accumulation of goods, which was more than they had before, and still within a native cultural tradition, in that it's not capitalistic or it's not consumerist as much as we know. Okay, so the increased efficiency of the hunt, increased possessions and materials, status. Your value as a human being after the introduction of the horse was basically how many horses you had, which then created the impetus for accounting coup, which means going into your friends, or not your friends, but your other people's area and taking their horses, so that gives you more status. Gun violence became normal, so there was an increase in violence. And I'm just going to read this stuff on polygynous, polygynous. Men now could have more than one wife, as the gun and horse afforded them the ability to take away more materials, and therefore the ability to provide for more women, I guess. So what Wilson is saying is this stereotype is not entirely made up, this second stereotype. There were nomads or buffalo hunters who were out there seeking visions, counting coup, traveling the prairies, and living on buffalo, following the migrations of the buffalo and so forth. So there was a bit of ground to base that stereotype on. Dempsey, now I'm assuming this is the professor in southern Alberta who is also I think he's in Indigenous Studies, but he's also a member of the Blood Tribe, so he's speaking from an experiential perspective. He argues a number of things about stereotypes. First, as a generalization, dealing with these types, or these typical patterns, it allows for the fact that people's real behavior is quite variable. So, you know, the idea of an Aboriginal person, a First Nations person from the prairies as being blah, 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 blah is not true. There's many different expressions of being human within the prairie framework that, you know, the stereotypes does not allow for that, so it's a problem. Dempsey says that we need to recognize the fact that the Blackfoot had a past, that they are not the same people as they were 100 years ago, and who among us is the same people that we were even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago. So it doesn't allow for progression, if that's a good word, or the changes in Indigenous thinking, Plains thinking, that allows us to survive better in our time, in our place in history. It recognizes, or Dempsey's saying, that the stereotypes that, well, this is a good thing, I guess, that the stereotypes do recognize that the today's Blackfoot and choices of life are based on that history. The values are rooted in life of the past, implies they have a future. So in other words, if they change in the past and move towards the present, that there is a future that the stereotypes will resist. The stereotypes, even though we develop as even though we develop in a certain way, the stereotypes of the Plains Indians is going to be resistant to those changes in our reality. So that's a negative impact of the stereotypes. And then finally, towards the end of the chapter, Wilson talks about Carter, who's a female. As far as I know, she's a female academic. I don't know anything about her. I'm going to try and get information on that. But she's saying that the stereotypes affect the thinking of government officials and academics. Stereotypes really limit the conversation on the table when you're trying to negotiate a new agreement or something like that. One of the sad examples in Plains Blackfoot history is the fact that even though Native people were keen on learning to farm, the attitude and therefore the policies made it difficult for Blackfoot farmers to be productive farmers. So that's one example of how suspicious ideas or superstition in terms of stereotypes affects, you know, the real lives and life today, and affects us today as well. It affects historian and anthropologists because it presumes a certain amount of truths as defined by the stereotype, which are neither truth nor a good basis to develop new thinking. So I guess the conclusion of the chapter is about the assumptions behind the stereotypes, and that these assumptions are real processes and they continue today to be a factor. The treaty process, for example, the number treaties, what Wilson and I think Carter are probably saying is that the idea of treaty equals the development of reserve land and gives up land to the white people and so forth is largely a product of the relationships between government people, academics, church, and the stereotypes that these people brought to the table in terms of trying to negotiate a treaty. So we see how the stereotypes factored into the content of the treaty. So this is very much a prairie Indian phenomenon, the number of treaties. Because treaties before that were friendship treaties, treaties after that did not require Aboriginal people to give up sovereignty of the land. And that's partly because the court said they couldn't. Something like that. Okay, treaty processes. Okay, we talked about that. Yeah, and that's about it. So it's really important to understand that stereotypes held by Europeans are basically a fusion of two stereotypes. One, at Plains Indian is the warrior, barbaric, meaning person is defined in Hollywood movies, and or they are noble, untutored, totally connected with nature, which is also a myth. So we're somewhere in between those two groups as a group, and even within that group there's a range of human behaviors that the stereotypes don't cover. So that's my reading of chapter 16 of Wilson's book on an overview of the plains. So I will leave it at that.